Ladies and gentlemen, we have breaking news for you. Last night, the WNBA Players Association released their latest counterproposal for the ongoing CBA negotiations. Everything looked great. We had a good feeling about things, that things were moving in a good direction. And then a couple hours after the WNBA released their latest proposal, the WNBA released a statement regarding it, and all the good feelings were suddenly gone. That's right, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the CC Report, and today we have the latest installment in the CBA talks between the WNBA and the Players Association. It's an important installment because yesterday, late in the afternoon, the WNBA Players Association released their latest counterproposal for the ongoing CBA talks. And not only do we have the counterproposal to discuss, but we also have the WNBA league response to the counterproposal also to discuss. The counterproposal was in the main a good faith move with some real concessions, specifically on revenue sharing and on housing, as well as some other key components that we are going to go over in just a second. I viewed the counterproposal as a step in the correct direction, definitely a meaningful concession on the side of the players. However, the league seemed to disagree, releasing a statement that was immediately dismissive of the new counterproposal. It was a complete and flat rejection of the counterproposal as being unrealistic, as being liable to cause hundreds of millions of dollars in losses. That is a claim that the league was making with absolutely no evidence to back that up. But then the league also included a warning that time was running out, which certainly is true. So we have had, over the last couple of weeks, a decided shift in tone in the negotiations between a pessimistic shift in which no movement was being made into a shift of more optimism and realism. Although the last proposal by the league did not include language on revenue sharing, it did include meaningful concessions on other areas, such as housing. And there was a real feeling going into this latest counterproposal from the players that there was some meaningful concession on both sides being made, and indeed the players did follow suit, continuing to operate in good faith and making meaningful concessions on revenue sharing, on housing, and in other areas. So this latest release by the WNBA has put a real damper on things moving forward. It has completely changed the tone of the negotiations from a tone of optimism, which we were at even 24 hours ago, to a tone of real pessimism and really wondering, is this actually going to happen? Are we going to run out of time? As the league pointed out, the clock certainly is ticking. And so what we're going to do today is go over that Players Association proposal, what is in it, and how it has compared to other proposals that the Players Association has released, and compare it as well to the most recent proposal by the league. Secondly, we're going to go over the WNBA's statement regarding that counterproposal and what influence it is going to have on the negotiations. And then finally, we're going to take a look at the timeline of two possible scenarios. The first scenario being that they continue good faith negotiations into the future and try to come up with some sort of compromise. How much time do they really have to do that before we start to lose games? And then secondly, if the worst comes to the worst and we do end up on a strike or a player lockout, what exactly does that look like, and how ultimately are we going to get out of it? So let's first consider the WNBA Players Association's counterproposal, and for that, let's turn to Annie Constable of Front Office Sports. The headline here, WNBPA seeks 25% of league revenue in counterproposal. According to the article, the WNBPA is seeking team-provided housing for all players in the first several years of the proposed CBA, in addition to a 25% share of total league revenue, averaging out to roughly 27.5% over the life of the deal. They also have proposed lowering the salary cap from $9.5 million down from a request of about $10.5 million. And so that is the core of the request from the WNBA Players Association. Let's compare that to their previous proposal, in which they put forward in December. And in that proposal, they were asking for an average of about 31% total gross revenue, starting at 28% in year one and escalating from there. Also, they were asking for a salary cap of around $10.5 million. So this offer from the Players Association drops their demand by about 3.5 percentage points overall. In year one, their demand is being dropped by 3 percentage points, and they're also lowering their cap request by $1 million. Let's contrast that with the league's most current offer, which is 70% of net revenue, meaning after expenses, and a salary cap of $5.65 million in 2026. There are also some housing twerks in there and 2 extra developmental spots included. We're going to leave that aside for now. I think that we're coming to a resolution on the housing debate, certainly coming to a better resolution than this revenue share discussion, which is the big kahuna. So let's take a look about why this concession, even though it is only 3.5 percentage points overall, is a major concession from the WNBA Players Association, a meaningful concession that is intended to move negotiations forward, that is intended to move the ball forward. And that is because of the exponential nature of gross revenue sharing. Each percentage point is a multiplier on the entire revenue base, which compounds as revenue grows exponentially. Revenue sources include the new media rights deal, expansion, both in terms of expansion fees that are paid into the league, but even if you don't want to include that, the mere fact that there are more franchises in existence means that there is going to be more revenue taken in by those franchises as they continue to sell tickets to games, and as they continue to sell merchandise, as they continue to take advantage of TV rights deals, as they continue to expand the schedule so that more games are played in more arenas. All of this leads to more revenue year over year, and so each percentage point that the players are giving up, it's not just a percentage point of revenue in one year, but a percentage of every dollar made over the exponential growth that the league is currently experiencing. Therefore, a concession from 31% down to 27.5% is a far more meaningful concession than, let's just say, 27.5% would be down to 24% of gross revenue. So overall, even though it only looks like 3 percentage points and it's not that big of a deal, in fact, it is a much bigger deal because of the multiplicative nature of gross revenue sharing. Contrast that with net revenue sharing, which is not multiplicative in nature. If you're comparing the two, the graph for the gross revenue share model would look more like a bell curve commensurate to the league's growth. However, the net revenue share would be more of a linear graph that would be commensurate, that would have no resemblance to what the league was experiencing in growth. And indeed, that is the entire philosophical debate between gross revenue share versus net revenue share. So, because the net revenue share fails to capture the exponential market growth, that is the whole complaint that the players are having, that the market is expanding greatly, but their player salary is not necessarily reflecting that growth. And so the question, what happens if the market no longer is exponential? What if it reverts to a more linear growth pattern that we've seen in the past? And my answer to you would be a gross revenue share model would also reflect that linear growth. It matches the growth of the marketplace, whether the marketplace growth is exponential or linear in nature. So a gross revenue share would capture whatever the market looks like, linear or exponential. So in either scenario, a gross revenue share would still be a fitting model to proceed upon. In terms of the positions overall, we see a very clear contrast between the two sides. We see the player side that are consistently and in good faith shifting toward the middle, as a good faith negotiation would do so. They went from a 40% ask originally of gross revenue share down to a 30% ask in December, down to a 27.5% gross revenue share ask now in their most a recent proposal. And just to put that in a real world dollar amount, the difference between a 31% gross revenue share and a 27.5 gross revenue share in year one alone is a sacrifice of approximately $55 to $60 million. However, the league, in contrast to that continual motion toward the middle that we're seeing from the players, we're seeing zero movement on the side of the league. Their offer has remained relatively static, 70% net revenue, and no motion whatsoever on that from the very beginning of the negotiations. So in terms of dollar amounts, we're seeing very static movement on one side, and we're seeing the players continually moving toward the center. And at some point, either they're going to have to move all the way over to where the league is at, or the league is going to have to budge out of their set ways, out of their static pattern, and continue to try and meet the players in the middle. I would say that the players have been acting in good faith. The question is, has the league? And I'm not sure that the answer is a positive one for the league in this particular scenario. So the players, in terms of philosophically, are as rigid as the league is. They have not wavered from their ask of gross revenue versus the league's not wavering from their net revenue. And that's really where the problem is. There's been no motion on either side. However, in terms of numerically, the players' argument is that because they have been moving closer toward the middle, they are doing a better job of being more conciliatory and moving negotiations forward. So in terms of revenue sharing models, we've got two competing interests, and they're very clear contrasts. And we've not seen surrender from either side, but we have seen movement toward the middle from one side. And that movement matters a lot based on the late calendar date. And we're going to talk a little bit more about what that means in terms of the calendar date in a little while. However, we do have to get to the league's counter statement to this proposal, this most recent proposal from the Players Association, because it was a stark statement. And let's go back to Annie Constable and see what she has to say. Here's the statement. The Players Association's latest proposal remains unrealistic and would cause hundreds of millions of dollars of losses for our teams. We still need to complete 2 drafts and free agency before the start of training camp and are running out of time. We believe the WNBA's proposal would result in a huge win for current players and for generations to come. This is a flat rejection. There is no room for interpretation. There is no room for argument. There is no wiggle room whatsoever in this league's response to the players' counterproposal. They regard this counterproposal as unacceptable, they regard it as unrealistic, and they regard it as a non-starter, a complete non-starter. Their claim about hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue lost has been a claim that they have repeatedly made, and they are also pointing toward the clock and saying that a deal has to get done soon to avoid missing games and missing revenue. There are some huge red flags in this statement alone, and the first and the most glaring red flag is the claim of hundreds of millions of dollars in losses. We've already heard this line come from the league before many times. What we haven't seen to sort of verify that claim is any sort of supporting data. We've not seen any spreadsheet. We've not seen any breakdowns of expenses or expense projections. We've not seen any sort of evidence that would point to the league having hundreds of millions of dollars in losses. In fact, all of the evidence that we've seen in terms of revenue over the course of the past year or so has been every single graph pointing straight up and pointing to the idea that not only is this a growth market, but it's the largest and most explosive growth market in women's sports or in sports in general. So the idea that they are somehow standing to lose hundreds of millions of dollars based on everything that we have seen publicly is a dubious claim at best, and at worst, it's a negotiation tactic that is intentionally manipulative for the public and for the players that is misleading us into thinking that they have less money than they actually do. The Players Association and the league, as we know, had a meeting a couple of weeks ago, and in that meeting, the league presented some statistics and some charts projecting expected player salaries versus the WNBAPA's projected salaries. And the difference between those two salary projections was only $55.8 million in 2026. The difference between those two salary numbers is only tens of millions. It's not hundreds of millions of dollars, as this statement from the league suggests that it is. And the delta between the two would not approach hundreds of millions of dollars, regardless of how long you extended the CBA, unless you had absolutely zero growth from 2026 to 2031, which is something that we know is not going to be possible. Instead, a more realistic projection of what the windfall that the league is going to experience over the next few years, we already know that they have a new media rights deal that is going to inject $200 million per year into the league's financials starting in 2026. This covers the projected salary gap of $55 million multiple times in the short term. Additionally, we have expansion fees. This is an injection of $925 million over the course of the CBA, coming in from Golden State and Toronto at $50 million apiece, Portland at $75 million apiece, and then three more franchises at $250 million each. Now, some people have said that these expansion fees ought to be set aside and not earmarked as windfall in terms of total revenue for the league, but my argument would be that at the point where we're inducting an expansion team every single year, that is something that can be projected as repeatable revenue sources over the course of the CBA and for the purposes of discussion. And not only that, but if it were actually true that 100% of the windfall from these expansion fees would be used to reinvest in the league to gain back ownership shares from the 16% that the league had to sell it to outside investors during COVID to maintain league solvency, that's a worthy goal, but we have no proof that that's actually what the money is going to be used for. And that's something that cannot be negotiated out once this CBA moment passes. But even leaving the expansion fees aside, the media rights deal alone covers the gap between the two salary proposals. And then additionally, we already see other sources of revenue, which I've talked about before. Attendance being up, viewership being up, merchandising being up, sponsorships being up, social media engagement being up. All of these arrows on all of these graphs are pointing up massively. 2026 could easily exceed the projected $680 million. And in this explosive growth environment, net losses, let alone hundreds of millions of dollars, as this statement claims are going to occur, are implausible at best. The math simply doesn't support it. And let me just say this. If you are a WNBA team owner in this explosive growth environment and you are not able to make a profit when you're getting a $200 million media rights deal, when you are getting expansion teams coming online, not only giving you the money to reinvest in your league, but also increasing the amount of attendance, viewership, merchandise, sponsorships, the entire thing. If you are not able to make a profit in this environment, you are not a good business person and you are part of the problem and need to sell your team to a business person that is better than you and that is able to make something of this situation, because there's never going to be a better situation than now in order to make profit. Let's take a look at some of the other red flags that are present in this statement. It's not just what's present in the statement, but it's the entire tone of the statement. For weeks, we've been hearing rhetoric about how things are productive, things are moving forward, we're getting traction, people are feeling better, people are optimistic that there's going to be a season, etc., etc., etc. All of that is gone with this statement, and we have reverted back to the sort of stalemate rhetoric from the league that we have had for months now. And in fact, not only the stalemate rhetoric, but the stalemate posturing that we had from the league for months now, when they wouldn't refuse to even consider what was on the table from the WNBA Players Association. And this idea that the timeline is running thin, that time is running short. Yes, it is. And largely that's because you refuse to even consider the statement and consider the proposal that the WNBA Players Association made for over 6 weeks, and it took a meeting with the Players Association in February for you to finally consider and respond to a proposal that was made in December. If time is now of the essence, it is largely your doing. And that's something that, now that you're using this rhetoric to hold the Players Association hostage or to gaslight them into thinking that they are somehow the ones responsible for it, to me doesn't ring true. It doesn't show that you're operating in good faith, and it doesn't show that you are being flexible. If it is indeed true that the league is unwilling to move from their previous position, that they're not going to consider anything other than net revenue, that they're not going to consider coming up from anything other than 70% net revenue, that they're not going to even engage with the Players Association on this central issue, if they're not even willing to acknowledge that the players have conceded significant ground, then there may in fact be nothing left to talk about. And if it is that eventuality that we are ultimately having to deal with, it is the league's responsibility, because they are the ones that are choosing escalation over negotiation. They are the ones that are choosing to hit the nuclear button instead of continuing to engage in good faith negotiations. Now, to be fair, I understand perfectly why the league is so reticent to engage on this gross versus net revenue debate, or to even acknowledge that the debate exists. And that is because the instant that the league concedes gross revenue share, regardless of what the actual number is, they could concede gross revenue share at a rate that makes the numbers equivalent to the numbers that they are already proposing. But that language concession alone would be worth the CBA negotiations to the player base, because gross revenue share by its very nature is capped only by total league revenue. It would require the league to open their books completely so we knew exactly what the revenue was and where the revenue was going, and it would disallow the league from having another lever of control over what is an expense, what is not an expense, how exactly do we calculate expenses. And that means that the league is giving up the ability to control and a lever to control what the player salaries actually are. But that is something that they ought to give up. That is something that the players are looking for. They're looking for an honest calculation of what their salaries ought to be. And right now, considering all the windfall that the league is experiencing right now and the relative lack of windfall that is translating to the player base, they are right to ask for this, because it seems like they're being deliberately opaque in terms of what exactly the player salary should be. The players can come back and make this continued resistance to the gross revenue sharing language harder to justify. They can continue to lower their bottom line dollar amount while holding on the gross revenue sharing versus net revenue sharing language. They can drop their proposal to a 20% gross revenue sharing ask, a proposal that would result in only a gap of about $20 million per year between the league's proposal of net revenue sharing plus salary versus the player base's proposal of gross revenue sharing without more of a salary base. A difference of $20 million between the two proposals would be a bridgeable gap in any reasonable scenario, and it would be something that the league would be hard-pressed to deny. However, as I explained, the mere switchover from net revenue sharing language to gross revenue sharing language, that may be something that the players ultimately feel is worth fighting for. So, right now, here's where we are. The ball is currently in the league's court. They can choose to engage on gross revenue sharing at an even lower percentage than what we're already seeing, or they can choose to keep rejecting player proposals and claiming future losses. If they continue to do that, then we've reached an impasse and there's really nothing left to discuss, because it seems clear that the players aren't going to budge on net versus gross, nor should they, in my opinion. The players have already compromised on their bottom line dollar amount ask, but now the league must compromise on structure. And if they fail to do so, then we're at a standoff. We're going to lose games. We're going to perhaps lose the season. And that responsibility falls squarely on ownership. Hello there, ladies and gentlemen. This is Future CC Report coming at you, and I just wanted to insert an addendum here a few hours after I recorded the video that you are now watching, but before I had a chance to post it. Sports Business Journal came out with an article that shed a lot of light on the league's mentality and what they could be thinking with their refusal to engage on net versus gross revenue share, and it might not be as bad of a situation as we are thinking. And that Sports Business Journal article is by Tom Friend. The headline is WNBPA's offer Tuesday closed the revenue gap by $200 million. This is exactly what I was talking about earlier on in the video that you're watching, is that because of the multiplicative nature of gross revenue share, any sort of concession from 30% down to about 27% is going to be a massive concession in terms of bottom dollar value. And further concessions are not going to be as big because of the multiplicative nature of the concessions. So let's read a little bit about the article as it stands right here. It says, the WNBA-PA's latest labor proposal shaved the revenue gap between players and the league by roughly $200 million, multiple sources confirmed Wednesday, with both sides also aware that a resolution on player housing is the other crucial pathway to a deal. It goes on basically to say that the estimate of the losses that the league was saying were going to be accrued by acceding to the player association's previous demand of about 31% were about $660 million. But going down from that 31% down to a 27.5% split of the gross revenue would shave about $200 million off of that total, resulting in about $460 million in league losses, according to their own math. As I've said before, that is dubious math as long as we don't have access to the books, but even by the league's own estimates, now that we know that a 3.5% reduction in the gross revenue demand equals a $200 million reduction in the resultant loss, according to the league, we now know that if we continue to drop at that specific rate, we have all of the numbers that we need to figure out when the gap is bridged between the loss that the league claims that it is getting versus what the players want out of their gross revenue share. And that number is actually a 22 or 23 gross split of the revenue share. This is a higher number than even I predicted in terms of what we would need in order to bridge the gap between the player base and the league. So if the player base lowers their demand to 23% gross revenue share, there's no reason for the league to say no anymore from a league loss perspective. And if they go even lower than that, down to a 22% split, then the league is still in the black no matter what. So 22% or even lower than that, 21%, 20%, these are numbers that even by the league's own math, they should be able to accommodate without compromising their bottom line. So even by the league's own math, we are in a place where there still is negotiation to be had. So the video that I'm dropping into is extremely pessimistic, and for good reason. Everything that I said in the video still applies, and we're about to talk about what the timeline will be if the league decides to strike or if the league decides to continue to negotiate. But as long as we know the math is out there by the league's own admission that a 23% revenue split or a 22% revenue split will result in the league being in the black by their own numbers, that is going to lead to an avenue out of this. So hopefully that made sense to you. I'm just talking off the cuff here, but I thought it was really important to drop in and give you that update from sportsbusinessjournal.com. Hopefully we'll see an answer from the league soon, and hopefully it includes some movement, because this is getting tiring. Okay, back to the video. Finally, let's take a look at where we go from here. We seem to be at a stalemate. We seem to be at an impasse. The first thing to discuss is at the time of recording, which is the afternoon of February the 18th, the day after these proposals and statements were released. We don't have a statement from the WNBA Players Association yet that is responding to what the league has said. So we don't know, really, we don't have any idea of what path we're about to go down, whether we're going to continue to negotiate or whether we're going to start escalating into a strike or a lockout. So let's examine both possibilities. Now, in terms of if we continue to negotiate, what does that look like? How much time do we have? And to answer that, we really need to work backwards from the proposed league starting date of May the 8th. There are a few things that have to happen in order for the league to begin on time. The first thing that has to happen is the expansion draft. We have two teams, Toronto and Portland, that need to have a team roster in place before they can start making moves. And so that expansion draft, not only do Toronto and Portland have to prepare for the expansion draft, but also the rest of the teams in the league have to prepare for the expansion draft. Once we decide on what the rules of the draft are going to be and what the specific salaries are going to be that the teams can work with, they have to have time to ready themselves. So let's figure a week from that. So once the CBA is proposed and agreed to in the main, a week later, we can have the expansion draft. After that, we're going to have free agency, and that actually has to have a couple of components to it. We need to have a period of restricted free agency for the RFAs to negotiate with their exclusive negotiating rights with their teams, and then an unrestricted free agency period. But not only do we have to have those periods of free agency, we also have to have a subsequent period of time for the new free agents to make their own arrangements, for them to find their new housing, for them to move their stuff, for them to physically integrate with their new communities. So we'll figure a week for the restricted free agency and then open to unrestricted free agency. But we're going to need probably about 3 to 4 weeks of free agency for the dust to settle and for the teams to understand exactly what their new teams are going to look like before the WNBA draft. Then we actually have to have the WNBA draft, which typically is scheduled for mid-April. But prior to that, we need to have pre-draft activities, meaning the WNBA draft combine, if there is one, meaning scouting for the WNBA draft, meaning the college players that are going to come into the system need to finish their own NCAA season, which won't occur until early April. So the WNBA draft currently is scheduled for the middle of April, and that seems to line up with everything else that needs to happen. So then after that, after the WNBA draft, we need a training camp, which usually takes place a week after the WNBA draft is held. And so figure about 3 to 4 weeks doing that. We could shorten that and include preseason games in that, but we can't shorten it to much more than probably 3 weeks. So if we're still going to have the early May tip-off, which is the scheduled tip-off for the WNBA, moving backwards, the absolute latest that we have to have a CBA done is the beginning of March. So we'll say March 1st, because after that, there simply isn't enough time to accomplish everything that we need to accomplish prior to the WNBA season starting. And so even with an extremely compressed schedule, if we pass that early March date, then we are going to necessarily have to delay games in order to get everything in that we need to get in. So that's kind of what things look like if we continue down the path of negotiation. But what happens if there's no more negotiation, if instead we've reached an impasse and it's time to do a lockout or a strike? So the first things that would happen is obviously free agency would be delayed. The expansion draft would be continually delayed. Players would be locked out of team facilities. Caitlin, for example, would no longer be able to practice in the Fever facility or practice with Fever training staff. She would have to make her own arrangements. Everybody would have to make their own arrangements. Moving forward, if the lockout or strikes lasted more than a few days or a few weeks, we would see the cancellation of the WNBA college draft. We would see the postponement, the shortening, or the cancellation of the WNBA training camp and preseason. And then finally, once we hit the date in May 8th, if we didn't have an agreement by then we'd start to see the cancellation of regular season games. And this could extend for quite some time, to be perfectly honest. If we have reached an impasse and if both sides truly are not willing to negotiate, then we could see cancellation of games lasting through May, into June, into July even, with no movement. I don't think that we are going to see a full cancellation of the season. I think that prior to that, we will see an end to whatever prolonged standoff that we have, but we could easily see cancellation or postponement of some games. So how would we eventually get out of a work stoppage? Well, typically there are three ways that a work stoppage ends. The first is the economic pain that a work stoppage would inflict both on the ownership group and on the players' association. If there are no games played, there is no revenue being generated. We're not seeing any of the TV media rights money that we would normally see, because that is based on the games actually being played. We wouldn't see any sort of ticket sales. We wouldn't see any sort of merchandise sales. We wouldn't see any sort of salary occurring for the players. We wouldn't see any sort of revenue sharing, obviously, for the players. So there is economic pain that's happening both for the player base and for ownership. However, if this is what brought teams back to the table, it is likely that it would be resolved in ownership's favor. And the reason for that is that the ownership's pain tolerance is significantly higher than the pain tolerance for the player base. Ownership is used to their WNBA teams not generating a profit. Many of the owners view their WNBA teams as either a tax shelter, or they view their WNBA teams as a community service, that owning those teams is something to do for the progression of women's rights, that sort of thing. And many of these owners are also NBA owners, or they're owners of some other means of income. It's not that they're not going to be financially hurt, of course they are, but their ability to withstand financial injury is much more high than the players' ability to withstand financial injury. Even though the players are able to supplement their income with Unrivaled, with Athletes Unlimited, with overseas basketball, first of all, not every player is able to withstand this. And secondly, even though the other players are able to withstand the financial pain, they're much more susceptible to being brought back to the table due to financial pain than the ownership is. And so at that point, if that is what brings players back to the table, then it's going to be with hat in hand, and the ownership group is likely to prevail in that situation. The second thing that could end the strike is public or external pressure from fans, from media, from other leagues, from politicians. Even high-profile voices in women's rights movements may exert pressure on both sides to come together and to find a deal. After all, the explosive growth that the league is experiencing is not just economic growth, but it is very meaningful in the continued quest to have women's sports taken more seriously and to get women to be on equal footing to men in a professional sports environment. And so the idea of going on strike and setting their league back, not only economically, but in terms of the advancement of the cause of women's sports in general, that is super important for our society. And because of that, there may be external pressure from a bunch of outside sources to get people back to the bargaining table and to get them to find a solution to this. So that could be a way out of this. The third and final thing that could get us out of this is a breakthrough in compromise, whether that is, the league finally acceding to the demands of a gross versus net revenue sharing, or the players finally acceding to the demands of the opposite, or finding some sort of a middle ground. The final possibility, of course, is mediation or arbitration. I don't think that the league is going to want to get that far, because it's going to require them opening their books, at least to the mediator or the arbitrator, and showing them exactly why they are claiming the things that they are claiming with regard to the hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue loss. And not only that, but they also, I feel, an arbitrator would look at the concessions that the player base has already made and compare it to other professional sports leagues around the country and around the world, and would come to a favorable conclusion that the player base is not off in asking for what they are asking for. So I think that the league wants to avoid a third-party arbitration as much as possible. So that's kind of where we stand right now. If we do have a standoff, if we do have a lockout, if we do have a strike, I ultimately think that it will end via one of these three avenues, but I don't think that it'll take the entire season. However, the potential to lose a significant portion of the season is definitely there. Now, again, we haven't heard from the Players Association. We haven't heard anything about a strike. We haven't heard anything about a lockout. And I would encourage people to not get super panicked about all of this until we start hitting that March window, because that March window truly is the 11th hour, where if we don't have anything done by that March window, that is the point of no return. So the clock is ticking. Currently, it is February the 18th. Famously, February only has 28 days in it. So that means that we have 10 days from right now to get something done. But it is possible to get something done. And even though things are not looking great from the player standpoint or from the league standpoint, it is not impossible. And so as long as they're working, let's keep the faith. So just to wrap things up, the WNBA statement and the WNBA's most recent counterproposal, in my mind, showed a real propensity, showed real movement toward the center, but the WNBA's counter statement really showed an inability or an unwillingness to move toward the middle commensurately. So at this point, it looks more and more like an impasse is possible, but we still don't necessarily have confirmation that that is the direction that we're headed. Let me know what you think. Do you think that this league is still operating in good faith? Do you think that it ever was operating in good faith? And do you think that there is a compromise out there that can be reached? Please let me know in the comments. I know this has been a long episode, but we've really needed to discuss all of the developments. And ladies and gentlemen, if you're not subscribed to the channel, please do so. If you enjoyed the content, make sure to hit those notifications. I'm going to post as soon as I can regarding all of the updates and developments as we continue. Hopefully we can get past the CBA and I can start actually posting about Indiana Fever actual team news and Caitlin Clark actual news, but right now this is the only thing that matters. So make sure to like and subscribe. Please share it with your friends. We've got over 100 followers on the channel, which is amazing. Let's keep that up. And ladies and gentlemen, we will see you in the next one.